Chapter 12. The Cemetery. As we left the French house and roared out the lane from the French house, the jeep nearly went over the embankment and down the hill on the far side of the road towards the hospital. It was dark, and Deo had decided not to turn the jeep's headlights on. I can only speculate as to why he didn't turn the lights on, but it may have had something to do with the jeep having been taken from the army base on the opposite side of the road. Or maybe he had other more nefarious reasons to not be drawing attention to the vehicle's speedy departure from the French house. In any case, at the last second, Deo saw the steep drop-off on the other side of the road and was able to correct in time to stay on the road and turn right towards Pleiku. He then finally turned the lights on, but then Ut in the rear, who had been clearly agitated while at the house, had been startled by Mark's sudden appearance, accidentally triggered his rifle through the canvas roof of the vehicle. It put a hole in the roof of the jeep, but thankfully didn't put a hole in any of the rest of us. Unfortunately, it only served to further heighten the stress apparent in Deu, and he yelled back an expletive in Vietnamese at Ut in the rear of the jeep. It was chaotic in the jeep. Guns going off, a jeep going too fast on bad roads at night, sometimes with the headlights off, soldiers cursing at one another for their misdeeds and not following orders, and another trying to navigate and give directions. Amid all the chaos, Deu was trying to get directions from Dom Kung sitting behind him in the jeep. Maybe Dom knew the roads and destination they had planned on taking me to better than Deu. Whatever the reason, at the moment, Dom yelled at the driver to take another right turn, and now we turned. I vividly recall the breeze coming into the jeep and blowing over my bare arms since I was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. I remember thinking, I am a medical doctor, and I am used to being in chaotic situations and being calm and taking control. I still hadn't given up hope that I could still somehow get this situation back on the rails. And so at that moment, I was still feeling as if I might be able to take back some control if I played this right. I thought, if I let them know that I had nothing against them and would be no threat to them, we could talk and work this out diplomatically. I was a pacifist. I had no intention of harming them. I would fully cooperate with whatever it was they wanted, and then maybe we could turn down the volume on the situation and talk it out in a civilized fashion. I soon learned otherwise. I turned towards Deu and started to say, I will co-op, but only was able to get those few words out before he turned and slapped me across the face. The message was clear. Shut up, say nothing, and do nothing. I realized then that there would be no taking back control of this situation. Shortly thereafter, a most wonderful, spiritual, and calming thing happened to me. A vision flashed onto the glove compartment door in front of me. I saw a clear vision of the face of Christ with the crown of thorns, with blood running down his forehead. Off to the left of that was a lamb, and along the bottom it seemed as if I could see the words Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shearer is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. I felt a distinct change come over me from a person who had been shortly before trying to gain control of an increasingly precarious situation to one who was willing to submit to whatever these soldiers had planned for me. By now, it was quite dark, and except for the moonlight peeking through the clouds, we eventually came to a large gateway, and Deu turned the jeep in that direction, and we drove through the gate and down a long gravel lane. I soon recognized by the monuments that were momentarily bathed in the headlights of the jeep as we passed that we were in a Buddhist cemetery. I had heard from other volunteers that cemeteries were where the Viet Cong felt safe from prying eyes at night and often dug tunnels into which they would hide from the South Vietnamese and American forces. The Vietnamese avoided visiting cemeteries at night because they revere their ancestors and don't wish to disturb them. Since there was little traffic through these cemeteries, this old tradition ironically gave the Viet Cong freedom to roam here in relative safety from the opposing armed forces because there was less chance of being discovered. Arriving in the Buddhist cemetery immediately triggered the thought that these soldiers might be Viet Cong. So now I began to wonder which of these big granite gravestones might conceal the opening to a Viet Cong tunnel and what it would be like to be inside that tunnel. It crossed my mind that this was where they were ultimately taking me. I wondered what it would be like to be taken into a pitch-dark tunnel. But then another part of my brain argued that none of this makes sense. These were neither Viet Cong nor North Vietnamese soldiers by their own admission. The soldiers who had burst into our house and kidnapped me at gunpoint were at least dressed like ARVN, South Vietnamese soldiers. Why would they have access to any tunnels in this graveyard? Or were they maybe North Vietnamese soldiers masquerading as South Vietnamese soldiers? But they knew about the commanding officer and his sons. Why would North Vietnamese soldiers know about the disrespectful hospital conflict that had just happened this morning? My mind just raced back and forth with all of the possibilities, and then before I could think for very long on those theories, the present deteriorating situation made those thoughts bouncing around in my brain a moot point. We had stopped, and one of the soldiers in the back seat grabbed me around my neck, and with a vicious jerk, he pulled me up and over the seat back into the back seat. In the process, my glasses broke and came off, likely landing outside the Jeep because they were later found on the ground. As if that wasn't enough to stretch every muscle and joint in my body out of place, together with the help of one of his partners, they placed me under the back seat. This American Army Jeep was constructed so that it had an under-seat compartment used for storage, where the seat flipped up like a box lid on hinges. So I ended up in this dark, rectangular, box-like enclosure under the seat for a short time. It wasn't a claustrophobic Viet Cong tunnel that I had imagined in my mind, but it was close enough. With the lid still slightly open, one of the soldiers kept a chokehold on my neck to restrain me from fighting back. The other roped my feet together and tied them tightly. Likely due to the chokehold on my neck and gradual loss of blood flow to my brain, I began having difficulty thinking and comprehending what was happening to me. I began to slowly lose consciousness. But in a remote part of my still semi-conscious brain, it seemed as if I was being told to just relax and let God take care of me. My medical training, or maybe it was just the more rational, scientific side of my brain, thought perhaps they wanted me to be completely unconscious. I no longer had any power to resist. At that point, I was unable to think clearly, but I did think that it might help if I weren't struggling and fighting against them. So I just let my body become motionless and tried to simulate an unconscious state for them. But even though I likely appeared unconscious to them, I could still easily feel what they were doing to me. Suddenly, one of the soldiers shoved a dirty rag in my mouth as a gag so that I couldn't scream or cry out for help. For some reason, as yet unknown to me, they didn't blindfold me, since my feet were already tightly bound, and then they tied my hands with a rope, and while doing that, removed my watch. Fortunately, I was only in the back seat for a short period until they had me fully restrained and figured out what to do from there. One of them then grabbed me by my feet and pulled me up and out of the seat compartment, then out of the Jeep feet first, over the bumper and onto the gravel lane. I had decided to remain as still and limp as possible, but at this point I did bend my neck forward a bit in a protective manner so that the back of my head wouldn't strike the bumper and the hard gravel when I landed on my back on the ground. Whether they noticed this small voluntary reflex, I'll never know, but it made little difference. They surely must have known that I was still partially conscious, because Dayu verbally ordered me to get up and into the kneeling position. What could I do at this point? Continue the charade and force them to try to slap and kick me awake? That didn't seem like a good idea, since they knew I was conscious. So I tried my best to comply with their orders and hoped not to escalate their anger any further. Now, getting from one's back to a kneeling position was harder than I expected, since my hands and feet were now tightly bound. The gag remained in my mouth, so I could not ask for help or mercy from the soldiers, but I finally managed to get from lying on the ground to up on my knees after an awkward struggle. Without any further warning, the officer drew his pistol and pointed it at my forehead. Later, as I reflected on that moment, I realized that I now had my answer as to why they hadn't blindfolded me. What would be scary about a gun pointed at me if I couldn't see it? So, what happens to a person when a gun is pointed at your head and you begin to think that your death is imminent? Does your life pass before your eyes, as they say? Whatever the initial thoughts of the moment, at that point, I knew that I was in some serious trouble, and what had started as a weird, awkward dinner invitation was taking a deadly turn for the worst. Dayu then began a long diatribe about Americans and the fact that I was a guest in their country and had no respect for the Vietnamese. I felt his deep-seated hatred for Americans ooze out of him and aimed directly at me. Deep down, I understood his hatred directed at foreigners, allies or not, who were occupying his country. How could one not hate those who were dropping napalm bombs on unsuspecting villages from B-52 bombers so high they could barely be seen, or helicopter gunships raining death at 600 bullets per minute on villagers with door-mounted machine guns? He angrily and pointedly told me that he was there to kill me. He raged that he needed to kill me for insulting his commanding officer by not giving his son the medical priority earlier that day. I was just like all the other disrespectful Americans. When he asked if I remembered seeing his commander's son, I had to admit that I had not seen the sons because they had not been in the examination room when the CO barged in on Prung and me. Since I had actually not seen the sons and couldn't speak because of the mouth gag, I truthfully shook my head from side to side in internationally recognized sign for no. Since he had not been part of the interaction at the hospital and assumed I was lying, this just enraged the officer further, and he ordered the other soldiers to kick me until I fell prostrate on the ground. Then, just as quickly, he ordered me up into the same kneeling position and started over with the same hate-filled harangue as before. By this time, he was screaming at me and had worked himself up into a frenzied rage. He repeated the whole speech once again. Did he think I didn't hear it clearly the first time around? I continued to kneel quietly and listened. Again, the basic theme of his diatribe was that I was an American guest in their country, and I thought I was better than everyone else and didn't give the Vietnamese people their proper respect. When he once again asked me about the commander's sons, I thought this time it might be better to nod my head yes, since no hadn't worked out so well the first time. So this time I tried to indicate with a nod of my head up and down that, well, maybe I did recall seeing the commander's sons and had just momentarily forgotten that fact. Truthfully, I still didn't remember seeing any sons of any soldiers in the clinic, but by this time it seemed like a moot point, and I was ready to say pretty much anything that I thought might calm him down. No such luck. He resumed kicking me until I was flat on the ground, and I wondered if this was possibly my last reprieve. Remember my earlier question about what goes through one's head when faced with imminent death? Well, it's sort of strange in hindsight, but in the interest of complete transparency, I need to be honest regardless of what the reader thinks maybe I should have been thinking or praying about at the time. With my mind racing from one thought to another, I first recalled seeing the scene of my mother and the rooster with its head cut off, running uncoordinatedly around the barnyard, bleeding copiously around after my mom's axe had cleanly separated its head from the rest of the body. That image seemed pertinent to my deathly situation, but didn't make as much sense as the next one. In a flash, my mind changed to the well-known amateur Zapruder 8mm movie of the president's assassination, where in slow motion, one can see the back of President Kennedy's skull and brains flying out and striking the rear of the presidential limousine. I suspected that it is just the mind imaging under a great deal of stress, imagining under a great deal of stress what one's own death might look like. Again, he kicked me down and had the other soldiers set me up each time I had been kicked down. He repeatedly had the other soldiers kick me, and I would hurl my body into a fetal position to try to protect myself from their vicious and violent blows. By that time, and possibly because I was not fighting back or resisting, only Dam Kung seemed to be able to keep up the intensity of the rage and violence against me. When Dao had them set me up for a third time, all that I could think as the muzzle of the gun was again pressed against my forehead was that this would be at least a very quick and painless death. I didn't believe I was going to hear or feel anything as the bullet tore through my brain. However, after he went through that disrespectful American tirade once more, I heard the tenor of his voice change ever so slightly. He softened his tone just a bit, and this time it almost sounded as though he was trying to strike a bargain with me. This is where it was a godsend that he spoke very good English, because I could understand very clearly what he was offering. Dayu said, "If I spare your life, you must promise that you will never tell anyone what has happened here. No one. If you do tell, I will find you and kill you." The message was crystal clear to me. Say anything about this experience and I die. Don't say anything and I get to live. I must say that given those two distinct options, it didn't take me long to weigh them and make a decision. I quickly took that bargain and nodded my head up and down empathetically. Yes. So he then repeated the terms of this bargain once more to be sure I had it clear in my brutalized and foggy brain. He then kicked me to the ground one final time and ordered the other soldiers to kick me a few more times for good measure. Then they all got into the jeep, backed down the driveway, and sped off through the archway and out of the cemetery. So now what? My mind was almost paralyzed. I lay motionless on the ground for quite some time, processing what had just happened to me, not willing to trust that the brutal assault was over. I wondered whether one of the soldiers might have gotten out of the jeep as it disappeared around the archway. Would they change their minds and decide to come back to finish the job? I thought maybe they might rethink the bargain we had made with one another and show in a barrage of gunfire from behind the archway that they had second thoughts about keeping up my end of the bargain. I tried to position myself on the ground and behind tombstones such that if they did decide to begin firing at me from a distance, I might be more protected and less of a target. I was in a very vulnerable position with a foggy mind, still tied up and gagged at the time. I continued to lie motionless for quite some time, listening for any movement or sound, unwilling to trust that the ordeal was really over. I was thankful that they hadn't blindfolded me, and I could see by the light of the moon there was no other lights nearby. Finally, I decided to sit up and happened to look up into the night sky. I saw a beautiful, bright, near full moon coming through the clouds, and at that moment a tremendous sense of peace came over me. Later, in reflecting on this and consulting an almanac, I found out that it was a day before the full moon, since full moon that month was the day after Good Friday in April of 1971. The exact timing of the assault became much more important to me years later. I wasn't sure what lay ahead of me, but I knew that God had protected me. I sensed very strongly that someone had known that I was in deep trouble and that someone had helped see me through a very dangerous time in my life. At that moment, as I looked at the sky, I saw the image of my father's face, as well as a second face. Was it a cloud formation or something else? Maybe. Another vision like I had had on the way to the cemetery in the Jeep? What I saw, other than a vision of my father, appeared similar to the face of my sister, Orlean. I wasn't sure, and it didn't make sense to me at the time, but I did have a real sense that others knew of my troubles at that very moment in time, and this seemed to be God's way of telling me.